Well, hey everybody, Kevin Makins, a regular pastor, back to answer the big question, should churches still be gathering during a pandemic? And the answer is obviously, I don't know. How would I know? Here's the thing about church that I think from the outside is hard to understand. Church is always hyper-contextual. It has to do with the particular city that you're in, or whether you're in a city at all. You might be out in the suburbs, you might be in the country, small town America, small town Canada, you might be in the Philippines. Church is super contextual. It's like a garden, and there are plants and things that grow indigenous to that garden. And while you could take a big old tree from another culture and drop it down in a foreign garden, it never really works well, and it tends to do a lot of damage to the soil. Really, church should always be grassroots, from the bottom up. It should be planting and harvesting and paying attention to what God is doing in every particular place, which means every particular place is going to respond to this pandemic moment differently. In our context, this looks a particular way. We had stopped meeting when the pandemic first started, paused for a couple of months. And then in September, when it seemed like things had settled a little bit, we began regathering. And I can go into what we did and what other churches might want to do in another video. If you're interested in seeing that, just like comment below or something. But we shifted to like multiple meetings during the week. We had kind of a rubric that we ran things through. But now in Hamilton, the city that I pastor in, we are in code red. So the government has put us into this highest level, Ontario's highest level of response before a total lockdown, which doesn't mean that we have to close our buildings, or that we have to postpone, cancel, move online, rejig our services. But we have chosen to. So while I don't really know if your church should be meeting online or gathering in person or all of the places in between, there are a few things I've learned that I think apply to every community everywhere. So here's 5 things I know for certain about how churches should respond during this pandemic. Number 1, we should listen to our governments when it doesn't force us to break God's commands. This is a theme throughout Scripture. You can find stuff about this in Romans 13. Some very nationalist Christians have taken this to mean that we should always do exactly what the government says, or that every leader that comes into place is like God's leader for this moment. But the fact that Jesus was killed by a Roman named Pilate and that the early Christians were tortured to death should also tell us that our relationship to the state should be uneasy. My general insights on it would be that we are to live peacefully in the kingdom that is, as we work to bring in a different kind of kingdom, or an upside down vision of reality, an upside down sort of politics. But this means that when it's not necessary, we should do our best to live within the structures that we have, to give unto Caesar what is Caesar's. So in this case, is it unethical for a church to stop meeting? At this point, I don't think that at least our government's recommendation to stop meeting in person is causing us to break God's commands. There are other ways to gather, to not give up gathering as the saints, to encourage each other and pray for each other. For a time, as a way to love our neighbors, it seems perfectly reasonable for us to say we can submit, in this case, to the government. We can submit to the powers that are ruling over us, not because they're our highest authority, they're not, but because what they're asking of us is quite reasonable, and they're asking it of many different groups. Which brings me to point number 2. This isn't persecution, at least not yet, not in my context. I don't know where you are in the world. This might be different. Again, context matters. But provided that we are receiving recommendations from the government, I don't think it would be fair to call this a persecution. There's a great article in Christianity Today about this topic that I'll link down in the description below, where the author was talking about when they've seen real persecution of the church throughout history and across the world. And it always fell along 3 lines: the motive, the duration, and the type. So the motive, what is the motive for churches stopping their gathering? Is the motive, we need to stamp out religion, we need to remove all authorities but the authority of the king, the emperor, the Caesar, what have you? Is the motive that we need to shrink these churches to be able to grab their land or their buildings or their power back? Well, that's not what we have in this case. In this case, it seems like, at least in Canada, the motive is genuine empathy and care for those who are most vulnerable. And so that's not persecution. Secondly, there's the length of time that this shutdown will be. Again, this is not we need to shut churches down forever. We need to shut churches down for as long as we can. This is for a season. And I think every church has to ask the question, What's the appropriate amount of time? When we in Hamilton go out of Code Red, we'll resume gathering in person. And so taking a couple of week pause is not persecution. It's just doing our best to love our neighbors and have solidarity with those around us who are also being shut down for a time. Thirdly, there's the type of persecution. Is this a persecution where people are disappearing from churches? Is this a persecution where Secret Service are raiding, where churches are being burned down, where people are being beheaded, tortured, imprisoned? I mean, this all actually happens around the world today and certainly throughout church history. And we are being asked to please meet on Zoom. I just don't think we should be crying persecution when these are the stakes. Now, I do understand that for many people, this is like the slippery slope that's going to lead us to that kind of persecution, but we have to be reasonable enough to draw appropriate lines in the sand at appropriate points. And at least for me and for us in our context, this, according to those three different markers, does not seem like persecution. This seems like a request from the government to us that we can choose to respond to in a way that loves our neighbor and helps us participate in the suffering of others in our cities and our places. Number three, churches, and specifically followers of Jesus in those churches, should not be afraid of death in the way the rest of the world fears death. I'm totally struck by how much of the news is about death. People are dying. There's death. We could die. You could get sick and you could die. And I feel like, okay, this is a great chance to remember that you're going to die. This is a really good opportunity to face down our inevitable end, be it in 20, 30, 50, 60 years, or be it next week, be it from COVID or a renegade bus that hits you down in the street or a horrible diagnosis of something else. You are going to die. I am going to die. Never let that escape your mind. And that shouldn't drive you to despair, but it should drive you to find freedom. Not freedom from having to die, because all of us are going to die, but freedom from the fear of death. In Hebrews chapter 2, it talks about how Jesus destroyed the weapon of the enemy, which was the fear of death, which kept men enslaved. And I love that. It's not that death is the enemy necessarily, but the fear of death that drives us to hoard toilet paper and hate those we don't understand. When Jesus removes the fear of death, we are now free to live fearless lives that are truly alive. Now, there's a nuance here for those people who have immunocompromised, who are elderly, who are most at risk. You know, it's like saying you shouldn't be afraid to drive your car, but you should still wear a seatbelt. And so we, as followers of Jesus, should not be driven in this season by our fears, but by our love. We should be the ones who are trying to take care of our neighbors, who are picking up groceries for others, and we should be the ones who insist that there are actually things worse than death. Those who are dying alone, that is worse than the death. The toll on mental health, the increase in suicide, the loss of meaning that people feel as things around them fall apart, that loss of meaning may actually be worse than death. Man does not live off bread alone, and our physical lives are very, very important. We're physical creatures, but they are married to a spiritual life, a life of meaning and purpose and connection. And if we lose that in this time, then we've lost more than just our body. We might have lost our souls. All right, number 4, no churches should be closing down. I hear people being like, the government can't make us close down our churches. Is that what you think is happening here? No one's closing down your church. You know, gathering together for an hour and a half on a Sunday morning is not the church. It is potentially the top of the iceberg, the most visible part of the church. But the church is the endless small connections that keep all that together. Church is a living community of people. I'm not one of those people who says, well, the church isn't a building, it's a people. It's like, yeah, I know. The building, though, matters. And the gathering time matters. And all those interactions that happen on a Sunday morning or an evening prayer meeting, those all matter. But there's so much we can do even when that most visible part of the church isn't accessible. The lack of imagination from some of the loudest Christian leaders who are fighting against closing down astounds me. I've had people say, well, if we're not singing, then it's not church. And it's like, really? If your mediocre rock band doesn't sing, it's not church? Okay, that was kind of mean. Look, it all matters. It's all good. But during this time, we get to ask new questions about how to be the church in a more simple, monastic, household-to-household sort of way. And in a culture where church has often been large and commercial and flashy, where every church has tried to become a mega church, maybe this focus on shrinking down, slowing down, and simplifying is actually a gift in disguise. Finally, number 5. It is un-Christ-like for us as the church to make this all about us. It's one of the things that also has been kind of freaking me out when I see these Christian voices saying, it's time for us to take back the politics. It's time for us to demand our rights. And as someone who gets paid by a church and is grateful for charitable status, I have sympathy for that, like, we gotta fight, we gotta keep our rights. But as an actual follower of Jesus, that language rubs me the wrong way. The core element of the Christian faith is fundamentally about not demanding our rights, but looking out for the rights of others. Philippians 2 talks about how Christ, in kind of the eternal mystery of God before he was physical on earth, Christ did not consider that equality with God, with power, with eternity, with strength and transcendence. He didn't consider that something to be grasped or clung onto, but he let himself become in the form of a human, and then even beyond that, to become a servant and to become one who died on a cross. The life of Christ is a downward trajectory, not an upward trajectory. The truth is, I don't worry about the witness that the church might lose if we stop meeting for a couple of months. Again, if it's a couple of years, that's a different thing. But if it's a couple of months or here and there as you enter into whatever your code red is in your area, I'm not worried about us losing our witness in the culture around us because of a season where we didn't meet. What I am worried about is us losing our witness by constantly demanding that we get what we want while businesses and nonprofits and neighbors are suffering and isolating and shrinking their lives down, not because they want to, but because they care about others or because the government has forced them to, which is not great. We should be the first in line to say, how can we help? What can we offer? How can we lay down our privilege, our power, our rights in order to care for our neighbors? If we're not doing that, then we are truly losing a distinct Christian witness in this time. So, should your church be gathering or not? I don't know, but ask some of these questions and then get creative. Find new ways to do things, experiment, receive this emptiness of the season as a gift, especially as we move into Advent. Love your neighbor, love your God, and witness to the upside-down, transformational kingdom of God that is truly good news in a difficult time. Okay, that's it for now. What are your churches doing at this point? Do you have any interesting stories? How are you guys navigating this? Let me know down in the comments below. And again, if you want a video that's more about what we are actually doing in this pandemic and the decisions we're making and why, comment down below. And if enough of you are interested, I'll talk about it. Grace and peace. Mwah.